Not two webinars, real people. I'm sorry we are a few minutes late because in principle, technology is always something special. We should be connected with Morocco because, we are partner with the OCP of Rabat, and the president should speak with welcome remark after me, but, we'll see if it works. Otherwise, we'll do things in a different way. So again, good afternoon. Welcome to everybody. And we wish you a very good time attending this conference today, Arab Geopolitics, as we call it. Some of you may be surprised, I'm sure, by the fact that we have chosen to hold a real event with real people present in the room, as I just said, after months of segregation and only the frequent use of web. We have been used to that mode for the past months, but we thought that to go back to a normal practice would be a signal of resilience and goodwill. We have taken the habit of holding every year since the beginning of the foundation, every year an event dedicated to the Arab region. And we want to continue this tradition. This is why we are here today, in fact. Even in difficult times, when many countries, Arab countries, are still closed, as you know, so that there will be not many speakers from the region, unfortunately, and the presence of the speakers cannot be assured. This is the reason why you will listen to some virtual presentations. In any case, today we are lucky to have been able to assemble in this room so much expertise, and I warmly thank the moderators and the speakers who have accepted our invitation to Rome, rather courageously perhaps, but they will be rewarded, I hope. Since its beginning, the NATO College Foundation has a strong focus on Arab affairs that we see as a priority for us to be addressed in the best possible way. There are very good reasons, I think, to continue to be interested in the region. Its strategic interest is evident before our eyes, but it's not only for that. There is also a rich humanity, full of history, and living close to our shores, hoping for a better future. This subject is a complex one, as you all know, and can be discussed from very different perspectives. To summarize, our final objective would be to see what we call an arc of crisis to be transformed into an arc of opportunities. And this part of the world has, in fact, an enormous potential for opportunity. Unfortunately, potential for the time being, I'm afraid. It is also clear that we have in front of us a vast area that is impossible to resume in simple formulas. Each country has its own history, its own tradition, expectations, its special position, and therefore deserves a special attention. Our intention in convening this conference is to look forward beyond present crisis and turmoil, looking for possible avenues to discuss about cooperative solutions. This is not an easy matter, and we need more than ever a clever analysis based on a good reading of facts. A further complexity, as you know, is given by the fact that national governments are no more the only actors on the international scene. We see non-state entities and pressure groups being active almost everywhere, and the Arab region is no exception. We live in a fragmented and multi-layered reality, asking for a special effort from us. I think that in conclusion, and we say it every time we speak about the subject, it is for the Arabs to take their destiny in their hands and to decide about their own future. But at the same time, we wish to extend a friendly hand in good faith in order to offer support. So we are here today to provide a basis for an honest and high-level discussion, as usual, in a spirit of mutual understanding and on a scientific basis. Our foundation was established in 2011 with the ambition to be able to connect with a larger audience on strategic issues and not only with specialists. And for this reason, we have produced various books related to our studies. It has taken a lot of efforts to organize this event in such difficult times as the present ones. And I would like to thank the director and the staff of the foundation for all their work. Special thanks for all those who have encouraged us and supported us in taking this decision. First of all, the NATO Political and Security Division and Philip Morris International. Many thanks are also due to our active partner, the Policy Center for the New South of Rabat, and its president, Karim. Thanks again to our speakers and moderators, and Professor Capel is going to open the discussion after the welcome remark. I wish everybody an interesting and fruitful afternoon. Thank you very much for your attention. Karim, if you are there, you can speak, I think.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Very well.
So, buongiorno. Thank you, dear Minuto, Rizzo, and my friend. This is a pleasure to be joining you from Morocco, and I'm glad that you have been able to get together for this important meeting. First, I would like to congratulate you, Ambassador Minuto, for all your efforts and all the work you've been doing with the NATO Foundation. And you've been continuing despite all difficulties along the years, and I think you should be congratulated for that, and also your staff for having a constant and resilient and persistent investment in dialogue. And I think that's my first message. At a time where we don't know, and nobody knows how the future is going to evolve, these are uncertain times. There's no, certain way ahead, particularly in the region we are looking at in this conference. So many uncertainties, so many parameters, so many actors with very different strategies, so many external influences, so many complex internal dynamics that no one can tell what's going to happen. I think you should be congratulated for continuing to investigate these topics. So my first message is about the younger generation within this context. We at the Policy Center are a young institution. We started 6 years ago. We are now about 100 people, 70% of which are researchers. And we care about two things. The first one, and I think it's very relevant in the discussion we will be having together here today. The first one is the North-South rebalancing. How to fundamentally, and I'm weighting my words, fundamentally transform the way we exchange, the way we dialogue, and the understanding of each other's. It's very important. I think Africa and the southern part of the Mediterranean is in a situation where the need for dialogue has never been as important as of today. And again, here, the work you're doing, Ambassador, with your foundation is essential, because I think this can only be solved through dialogue and understanding. And the work of think tanks like the Policy Center, like your foundation, is essential in this perspective. And so that's the North-South rebalancing, where as equal partners, as people of values with tolerance, openness, a belief in fact-based, evidence-based policymaking, are trying to create space and platforms for that dialogue to happen beyond official channels, which have the limitations we'll all know. The second rebalancing we're trying to foster and to work on is intergenerational rebalancing, to give more space to the next generation, and it's particularly important in the dialogue and in any solution that will emerge in a word that I don't like very much, which you call the Arab world. As you know, Morocco has a specific perspective about the Arab world. Morocco is not only an Arab country, but it's a mixture of Africans and Berbers and Arabs and, you know, Mediterraneans, etc. So, but this is semantics. But I think what is important here is to give more space to the younger generation. And how do you do that? We have several instruments, and dialogue is one, I mentioned it. Another one is through young leadership programs, activity, which we do at the Policy Center, which is for me very important because after all, this is their world, the next generation, you know, people under 30 or 35 years old, just to simplify the discussion. And I think it's a very important aspect of the work we do as think tank, and will be a fundamental and essential part of any sort of solutions for this region that has been living, you know, sort of turmoil since the last 10 years. I come from a country which has been, you know, quite, you know, well managed, and where we have you know, serious policies and stability, but we also, of course, care for our neighborhood, which is you know, on the eastern side of us, which has been living you know, difficult situations such as in Libya, of course, and Syria, not to mention, of course, other countries such as Yemen, for example. So what I can tell you, us as think tanks, as people of, you know, working in research, with a passion for peace, for tolerant dialogue, for fact-based analysis and evidence-based policy making, what I can tell you, our contribution is really to open space, to over-communicate, to multiply the channels of communication so we can understand each other. And that's what we can do, us as think tanks, or you know, the NATO Foundation as also a think tank. Then this is where we meet with you, Ambassador. This is where we have a convergence. This is where we provide those platforms to be able to find out solutions. Because in the end, only dialogue will find out solutions in this, you know, in the various difficult situations that we are living in this region, and particularly. We need to have all the actors reveal their preferences. And through dialogue, you cannot hide. If you multiply dialogue, if you multiply interactions, you cannot hide. You have to tell what is in your mind, and you can reveal the, you know, the players, the objective, the functions of the players, so they reveal their preferences, and we can build on that. Solution. And I believe that, you know, civil society is an essential component of any solution in the region. And my concluding point will be about Europe and the region. And I think Europe is a central partner, is a long-standing partner, is a trusted partner of the region, and particularly the Mediterranean, but I will extend it to Africa. And here, I think this is the same kind of issue. We need to, you know, sort of change the dynamics and intensify dialogue on very important issues that are of importance for domestic politics in many countries, such as migration, for instance, in European you know, societies, but also the issue of economic growth, inequality, changing labor markets, you know, challenges ahead. So, unfortunately, I have no solution to offer to you, but what I have is the commitment of institutions like us to create platforms with in front of the highly complex matters that we are facing and the high uncertainty we are facing, create the platforms that will enable us to discuss and to exchange and to be able together to have solutions, not a solution forever, it doesn't exist, but permanent channels of dialogues, permanent frameworks, permanent institutions, so as to come up with you know, policies, solutions, agreements, treaties, whatever they are, that you know, have the potential to improve the future path of nations. And I think we're all being challenged. Middle classes in advanced economies are challenged by robotization, by the changing dynamics of globalization, by aging populations. On the African continent, we have other sort of challenges, of course, economic growth, inequality as well, labor market, youth unemployment. So there's plenty of topics where we can find solutions together. But again, I think the current state of dialogue in general, and dialogue in the Socrates, notion of things, in the anti-Greece way of seeing what is dialogue about, is suboptimal today. And this is exactly why we are strongly committed to the partnership we are having with the NATO Foundation in Rome, and in general with partners, because we believe in the virtues of dialogue to find solution to very complex problems that are challenging us and the rest of the world. Many thanks again, and it's been a great pleasure to partner with you, Ambassador, in this event.
Thank you very much, Karim. Thank you. I'm sorry that you are not here with us. We'll try to do better next time, but there is a limit to our capacity. We have been investigating almost every week if the flights from Rabat or Casablanca or Marrakech were open, and the answer was always negative. So, too bad. Anyway, thank you very much for being with us today. We're very, very grateful for that. Have a good time. Stay healthy.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And now, Colonel Huber, the NATO Defense College.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's a privilege for me to be here. It's a privilege to see some familiar faces and friends of the NATO Defense College. I am here on behalf of the Dean of the NATO Defense College, Dr. Stephen Mariano, and our new Commandant. For those who know the NATO Defense College, we just recently went under a change of Commandant. Lieutenant General Chris Whitecross just returned to Canada and is planning on retirement. And we welcomed Lieutenant General Olivier Ritteman, French officer, most recently coming from SHAPE. So we're under new leadership at the college, and it's a pleasure for us to partner with the NATO Defense College Foundation and with the Policy Center for the New South with this event. The region continues to be a topic of great interest for the college and an impetus for some new initiatives as well. Even with the challenges of COVID-19, we continue to entertain and receive requests for visit exchanges and academic exchanges with entities in the region. A few of the more notable activities at the NATO Defense College in the future include a modular short course, which is patterned after a 1 week of our flagship senior course at the ICI Center in Kuwait. We also have an initiative for a Gulf Week in the future, which is patterned after the NATO Defense College Kiev Week, which is kind of an exported week of our senior course, a kind of a standalone course that has been very successful in Kiev. We've also undergone a recent test and trial structure at the college in which we've enjoyed the participation of an officer from the ICI, Captain Nasser Marafi, a Kuwaiti Navy captain, and we have included a request for a Med Dialogue officer in which we'll put the NATO Defense College more in line with the NATO headquarters strategic partnership framework and allow us to more fully engage with partners in the region. So these are just a few examples to highlight the interest that the NATO Defense College has in the region and why it's in addition to those that have been mentioned already, and why it is important for us to partner and help sponsor with events like this one. So on behalf of the NATO Defense College Dean and new Commandant. Let us add our NATO Defense College welcome to you and hope you very much enjoy this conference. Thank you.
According to our liturgy, this was, we all have our own liturgies. This was the, in a way or in another, this was the welcome remarks, but the real conference is starting now, and Professor Capel will be the first speaker opening the afternoon.
Allora toglio la maschera. Je tombe le masque. So thank you very much for inviting me to this lecture. I'm very impressed by the number of people attending. I thought that the survivors from COVID-19 would be much fewer in number. And it's glad to see that there are still some real people around. I would also like to extend my salute to Karim in Morocco, and as he mentioned, that his country was pluricultural and dimensional, so I'll say ahlen and azul and bonjour from far away. And well, even though I was introduced in the brochure as someone who professes out of Switzerland in Lugano, which I proudly do. I'm also a French citizen, something I cannot hide, even with my accent in English. And as you know, when we deal with the challenges of the Mediterranean and the Middle East nowadays, definitely there is a big issue with NATO itself. On Friday, 24th of July, in a NATO country, Turkey, the former museum and former Byzantine church and cathedral of Hagia Sophia, Saint Sophie, was returned into a mosque. And President Erdogan attended the prayers, and the imam carried a saber, a cimitero, with him. Because he just wanted to emulate Sultan Mehmed Fatih, the conqueror of Constantinople, on the 26th of May, 1453. And in what is called in Turkish, Kiliç Hakkı, which is the right of the saber, i.e. a place which has been conquered for Islam by the saber cannot be given away if not by the saber. And this mix of religion and military is, of course, something which is a real issue that we have to understand. This is probably part and parcel of the new, should we say, post-COVID geopolitics of this watershed year to 2020, which, as we know, saw and is still seeing, and the very day we're speaking, even a country like Morocco has had to take very severe measures to restrict travel between a number of Moroccan cities, of major Moroccan cities, which have been locked down. And but this is also a year which started with a major military incidents, something which did not really follow the traditional ways and views of the military confrontation, the termination or vaporization of Brigadier General Qasem Soleimani, who was visiting Baghdad, probably in order to put down the Iraqi Shia insurgency against the Iranian plundering of their resources, of their oil resources, by a US drone. And this is also a year that saw the oil market crash. The barrel went to an unheard of low because the value of the barrel someday in late April went down to minus $36 a barrel. You would pay $36 for someone to take away a barrel of oil from you. Even though it has gone up again and is more or less stabilizing around $40 for the time being, nevertheless, this means that trillions of dollars are going to miss in the budget of the Gulf states that Ambassador Minuti mentioned earlier on, with unforeseen consequences. How are the oil exporting country going to manage? What are they going to have to cut down in terms of financing, of subsidies, not only for themselves, but also for a whole Middle East Mediterranean region, which has functioned since the October 1973 war, also known as the Yom Kippur War or the Ramadan War, according to your religious preferences, which has largely lived on remittances from oil money. This is a sea change, if I may say so, as we're close to the NATO naval base in Naples. And this is still very unpredictable. I believe that we now have to reorganize our way of thinking, and I'm very pleased that the NATO Defense College opportunely decided to take that into its hands, because we need to rethink NATO's role in the region. When one NATO member buys Russian SS-400s, when a French frigate tries to check what is in a Turkish ship going to Libya, and a Turkish warship catches it on its radar, this is a problem we have to deal with. We cannot just hide our head in the sand. And also, as Karim mentioned, I believe that as members of the European Union, for most of us around here, we also have to take the matter of defense and security into our hands. Something we have not been able to do. Personally, I feel extremely optimistic after the meeting that took place in Brussels between heads of states and governments last week in order to put the EU in order of battle for in order to tackle with the economic and social consequences of the virus. But we cannot shun from a resolute security and defense policy for the Union. Whether it functions with NATO, it is supplementary or complementary to NATO, is something to be discussed. One last point is that the dire straits, to use another marine metaphor, that we're in today are also due to the major uncertainty about American policy in the region. What was called, if I remember well, at the last Munich Security Conference, the advent of Westlessness, sounds awful even to a French ear, is something that has changed many items since not only the World War II, but also since after the demise of the Soviet Union. If the United States consider that they couldn't care less about what happens, or they have minimal interest for what happens in the region, this means that other actors are going to pop in. When I was young, which is way back, we used to say that the most important country of the Mediterranean was the Sixth Fleet. Is it still the case? When Turkish ships start to look for natural gas ashore from the Turkish island of Castellorizon, another NATO member and a EU member, I haven't seen that much of a move, except for my compatriots who didn't have much support from the others. And we now see the rise in the Eastern Mediterranean of two regional powers with a very strong feeling for revanche. One being Turkey, under Mr. Erdogan's leadership, extending close to a century after the treaties that followed World War I and that are considered by the present Turkish leadership as a betrayal of the spirit of what was at the time the Ottoman Empire, the Sèvres and then Lausanne treaties. We are seeing a sort of feeling that whatever was Ottoman now should become under Turkish influence, whether it be in the northwest or north of Syria, in Iraqi Kurdistan, in Libya, where some 7,000 rebel Syrian fighters have been shipped aboard Turkish ships or plane, while a lesser quantity of pro-Bashar Syrian fighters were shipped by the Russians to Benghazi to fight on the side of Marshal Haftar. And from what we hear, there's a significant discrepancy in the payment because the Turkish mercenaries make $2,000 a month, whereas the Russian mercenaries make only $1,000 a month. So there's still some oil money around. This is a major problem. Who's going to police all that? How can we manage? Russia also has made a very good use for its own sake of the lesser presence of America and of the West. It has used Syria as a means to reconquer superpower status, which it doesn't have for what Russia has become. But nevertheless, Putin used very astutely his limited military means to counterbalance Western influence and used masterfully its diplomacy thanks to a vibrant school of specialists of Islam, of the Arab world and the region in Russia, as opposed to the total decay of Arab and Islamic studies in the West, underfunded and despised. This is a major challenge for all of us. And as we are speaking, of course, we are waiting for the November 3 American presidential election. Everybody in the region is looking at that also. Bibi Netanyahu, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Vladimir Putin would definitely like to see a re-election taking place. Many others are not of this feeling. And as of us, for European members of NATO, we hold our breath. But we cannot put the future of our countries, we cannot put the future of our security, we cannot put the future of our defense under the sole aegis of what has become, from my point of view, erratic American policies. We were used to consistent policies. The sort of line that was favorable to a lesser American presence in the region, of course, was based over the last 3 years on the fact that America, or the United States of America, had become a net oil exporter. And that in 2019, America was the first oil producer with 15 million barrels a day ahead of Russia and Saudi Arabia, which, as you know, led to the fact that Russia decided to boost its production in order to have the prices go down so that the shale oil producers would be ousted from the market. This was a sort of sorcerer's apprentice decision on the part of Putin, but nevertheless, this will mean that America will now have to buy oil again. Hence, the logics that decided that you would not send American boots on the ground in the region because there was no oil fields to protect at such a cost and at such an electoral cost, because, as we all know, President Trump was elected in 2016 thanks to the fact that he won 3 states, swing states, in which so many young people had come back dead from, as they say, their Iraq or Afghanistan, is something which is now will now have to be reconsidered, because America, for the year to come or the years to come, will not be able to be independent because shale oil drilling is not competitive anymore. So these are, in a nutshell, a few ideas about what we are facing in the region. And my role here was to put some salt on our wounds, but this was also for our common good, so that the 2 panels and roundtables on civil society and on geopolitics that will follow will bring us the solutions. I've just been asking the questions. There again, I'm very grateful, and that the NATO Defense College decided to tackle those very important issues at this very defining moment. We're maybe at one of the watershed years in the long period, I would say after World War II and after 1981 and the demise of the Soviet Union. We're definitely at a defining moment in geopolitics, in the future of the Mediterranean, and in the very future of Europe. One final word to answer, follow up on what Karim Ainaoui mentioned earlier on. If we think that the sort of massive Chinese supply chain is now an unbearable political challenge, it may be time to rethink the complementarity of the two shores, of the many shores of the Mediterranean. The cost of labor in Morocco is now lower than the cost of labor in China. If instead of sending things being made in China, if we could integrate better the Mediterranean with the European Union, think of the capacity of Tunisia, of Morocco, to some extent of Egypt, maybe tomorrow of the Levant after its reconstruction. And after all, this was the path that Turkey had taken when Mr. Erdogan was lauded by everyone 10 years ago. This may offer a very important option for the future. But in order to deal with that, we have to be firm on security issues. We have to have a NATO and an EU doctrine on that. If we don't, we're in dire straits. Thank you very much. Vi ringrazio molto per aver sentito questo francese parlare in inglese, ma anche questa è una sfida per il futuro.
Right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Claire Spencer. I flew in from London yesterday, and I wish to join all those who've congratulated the NATO Defence College Foundation for having initiated what I think for many of us is the first time we've met in such numbers at an event like this. And for those of us who go to many conferences, boy, we've missed them. So thank you very much again. I also wanted to draw on, and thank Professor Capel for posing so many questions, which I think this panel has been tasked with addressing. But in passing, when he mentioned the Sixth Fleet, I also was reminded that I grew up in what was then Great Britain, perhaps still is, singing a patriotic song about Britannia rules the waves. Well, that was no longer true even before I was born, and yet somehow the song is still there. So it shows how control over the Mediterranean cannot be taken for granted, that it does change, and some of the received continuities and wisdoms we've had about the region are indeed being challenged in exactly the ways that Professor Capel put forward. So it's up to this panel not only to expand the analysis of what's going on, but also to try and come up with some solutions or propositions as to what are the priorities when we look at this region. And interesting, the way it's being organized is that we have two virtual speakers and two live speakers on the panel. We'll be starting with one of the virtual speakers. Everyone is asked to speak for about 7 to 10 minutes. Then I'll react with some preliminary discussions or preliminary questions to kick off the discussion. And then you, the live audience here, will be allowed to ask questions, but also there will be virtual questions which we sent in by those who are tuning into this virtually. So let's hope it works, because it's real and technology. But for those of us who've been spending the last 4 months on Zoom conferences, I hope the live aspect of this is a bit of a relief. Anyway, our first speaker, the biographies of each speaker can be found in the live leaflets, but also online. please welcome Giovanni Romani, who is head of the Middle East and North Africa section in the Political Affairs and Security Policy Division at NATO HQ. He's joining us from Brussels. So welcome. Please, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, and I wish I had a more interesting background like the one you have. But thank you for this opportunity, which I will not use to deep dive into the strategic situation in the region, as others will certainly do more eloquently today. Instead, I will focus on the current NATO framework, our ongoing activities, and I will offer some key challenges that we need to address towards an enhanced engagement in Middle East and North Africa. So the region is indeed central to NATO's strategic future, and the alliance is not only focused on the east flank, but has adopted a 360 degrees approach, with this region remaining at the heart of the global security. And one of the three NATO core tasks is actually cooperative security, and NATO and its partners in MENA not only share geographical proximity, but also similar security challenges. And with the increasing instability, these partnerships are more valuable than ever. As most of you know, the two primary vehicles of NATO engagement are the Mediterranean dialogue with Israel and 6 Arab countries, and the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative with 4 Gulf countries, UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain. And last year, we actually celebrated the 25th anniversary of the Med Dialogue and the 15th anniversary of the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative. Let me underline how, despite the tremendous political changes across the region in recent years, which have made the MENA region more fragmented and more unstable, NATO's partnership frameworks have proven to be fairly resilient. Beyond the engagement with individual partners, they also have provided an invaluable forum through which we've been able to discuss, assess, and to some extent also jointly address these common challenges together, often offering an umbrella under which partners could have the diverging position. Let me give you an example of Israel together with the 6 Arab countries. And at the time of the Gulf Cooperation Council crisis, the Gulf countries continued to meet under the NATO umbrella. But what this partnership translates into in terms of concrete cooperation? I will in the cooperation areas, I will just
Is this, or have we lost the connection? Can anyone indicate whether it's being restored or whether in fact we should come back? All right, we'll give it a few minutes to restore the connection and then we'll come back. Is it back on? Good.
Am I back? Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Welcome back.
So I was talking about the NATO ICI Regional Center in Kuwait, which was created in 2017. Close to 1,000 participants from all 6 GCC countries have benefited from the training activities, mostly in 2018, 2019, in the middle of the GCC crisis. Second, we have a hub for the South, which was established in Naples to help enhance alliance strategic anticipation capacity. And the hub is becoming more and more a key tool to better understand the region and facilitate NATO engagement. Military education and training are the cornerstone of NATO regional policy, and Middle Eastern partners participate in various programs, military exercises, operational courses. Let me mention the NATO School in Germany, and also the NATO Defense College, which delivers a regional cooperation course, which has trained over 600 officers from NATO and Middle East to date. The Alliance and MENA partners also collaborate on counter-terrorism, in capacity building, but also learning from partners' experience. And as I speak in this very second, there's an ongoing meeting of allies with one of our meta partners on countering terrorism. We also have, as you know, the NATO training mission in Iraq, supporting Iraqi armed forces to prevent the resurgence of ISIS and other terrorist groups. Qatar is providing airlift assets coordinated by the NATO Zero Atlantic Disaster Response Coordination Center to support the UN efforts to fight the COVID-19 pandemic and fly medical equipment to 3 African locations. Mauritania. Over the last few years, NATO has helped Mauritania establish a crisis management center in Nouakchott and 4 regional operational coordination centers under the NATO Science for Peace and Security program. New project, Copromedios, has now been launched to improve the coordination between the Mauritanian civil protection and health emergency systems. And this will also have an impact on the broader Sahel region. Jordan. Together with the United Nations, NATO has assisted the Jordanian National Center for Security and Crisis Management in achieving full operational capacity. The center was key to monitor and address the Jordan response to the pandemic. These are just a few examples. I could expand on many more, but I want now to move to my third and final part, which is looking into the future. So in April this year, the NATO foreign ministers called for an additional NATO engagement in the Middle East and North Africa, focusing on various aspects, including what more NATO can do to fight terrorism, build stability, and strengthen the partnership across the region. This package of additional measures includes lines of efforts such as education and training, interoperability, crisis prevention, public diplomacy, fighting terrorism, and improved coordination with other international organizations. We're working hard to translate this general guidance into concrete measures, but what I want to do now is to offer you the key challenges that we are encountering. So the first, with the exception of Iraq, where, as you know, we have a NATO mission, we are far from having an active direct role in the dramatic crisis that affect the MENA region. Allies have very different positions, and in some cases, these dynamics also affect NATO relations with the MENA partners. So the challenge is to navigate these complexities, to bring added value while preserving the cohesion of the alliance and maintaining fruitful partnerships. Second, how can we intensify our political engagement and cooperation with the countries in the region with an approach that will be agreeable by all allies, avoiding the enemy of the minimum common denominator? Third, we need to improve coherence among the various activities, both from NATO as such and also bilateral by allies. A number of allies bilaterally engaged in the Middle East, of course, and North Africa. We also need to strengthen the coordination with other international organizations. Compared to the EU, the UN, NATO has a much lesser engagement, although it's concentrated on specific areas, defense and security. And the lack of a permanent presence, with the notable exception of Kuwait and, of course, Iraq, is certainly a limitation for NATO. So the fourth challenge is posed by Russia and China's increased influence, with Moscow playing a key role in some theaters, with security and military issues dominating its approach and actions, and of course, economic ambitions determining the Chinese approach to MENA. The fifth challenge is on public diplomacy. At times, we hear about how most regional stakeholders, and to some extent also international organizations, have a distorted and biased image of NATO. And this has an impact on the quality of our interactions. Is it really so? And how can we better communicate the values, the objectives, the activities of the alliance in the region? And to which audiences? Because every nation is different from the other. And what we need is a more evidence-based approach. So we're launching 2 studies to better understand where we need to focus our communication. And my final point, which is the sixth challenge, is I want to underline how our main effort must focus on outreach, consultation, teaming up with our partners, We have common security challenges. Most of them affect them much more than they affect the allies. For example, terrorism. We have a lot to learn from their experience, and we need to build on what we have done so far, but we need to move towards an even more constructive and two-way street relationships. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for overcoming the technical hitch in the middle. That's admirable. Next up is Yosif, who's with us in person, who is Deputy Director of Columbia Global Centers in Tunis.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to the Foundation for having me here, finally outside of Zoom. It feels good to see that Rome is eternal as ever, and very happy to be here. I will talk about the regional dimensions of the Libyan conflict and its effect on the neighbors, actually. So in the beginning, I'd like to nuance the idea that Libya became an issue in recent years and after the NATO intervention of 2011. Actually, we should remember that Libya was already a headache for its neighbors during the Gaddafi era due to the mercurial nature of Gaddafi and the hegemonic tendencies of the Jamahiriya regime. But it's true that the problems emanating from Libya today are of different nature and have multiple sources. Rather than only one source during the Gaddafi time. The first problem, or one of the first problems, is the one related to illegal trade, be it human trafficking, weapons, drugs, and so on, which is controlled by criminal organizations whose reach will be hard to dismantle in the future, and frankly, they are little addressed internationally. The second issue, which is much more addressed from the international community, is terrorism. Terrorism or radicalism, which is a recurrent threat in North Africa and the Sahel, and Libya offered a fertile ground for the development of terrorist organizations, even though the problem is less acute than feared in the past. I mean, compared to the dire predictions we used to give 5 years ago when ISIS was said to be moving from Syria to Libya, it is less dangerous than that, but it is still an issue. And the third big problem with Libya today, after illegal trade and terrorism, is the fact that Libya today became a global geopolitical arena, not unlike Syria actually, obliging Libya's neighbors to rethink their alliances or act according to them. And from what we see today in Libya, the scenario is not leading towards international cooperation at all, but rather of maybe some kind of balance of power competition if it works. Today, this is something that kept emerging year, that kept developing year after year. Again, if you look 5 years ago, solving the Libyan conflict would have required, of course, putting the Libyans together. But apart from that, would have required putting maybe the Qataris and the Emiratis together on the same table, and that would have helped to solve the conflict. Today, in 2020, there are several layers of conflict in Libya. In addition to the Gulf proxy war that I just mentioned, there is some kind of superpower struggle between the US and Russia. There is an intra-NATO dispute between France, Greece, and Turkey. There is an intra-European disagreement between France and Italy. Egypt is fully involved in the conflict. There is also a Turkish-Egyptian tension that is growing, and every day we keep hearing new things. So today we've heard that there are preparations on the Libyan-Egyptian borders. There are also, of course, several armed fighters from Libya's neighbors, southern neighbors, such as Sudan and Chad, who are in Libya. So put together, this means that Libya's neighbors need to focus their energy, all their energy, on Libya. Take Egypt, for instance. The country has demographic and economic struggles. The country is absorbed in a contest with Ethiopia over control of water resources, which are vital for Egypt's survival. Egypt is also engaged in fighting an ISIS insurgency in the eastern Sinai province. It is also one of the most infected, of the most affected Arab countries with COVID-19. Yet amid all this, Egypt ends up drawn into Libya. And in Libya, that's where Cairo sees that its national security is threatened. Also, Egypt is trying to counter Qatar and Turkey in Egypt and to consolidate its ties with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Take Tunisia also. The country has 450 kilometers border with Libya, so much less than Egypt or Algeria. But the effects of the Libyan conflict are felt in Tunisia more on the political than on the security level. I don't know how familiar you are with the Tunisian politics, but there is yet another political crisis in Tunisia. The government just resigned. There will be hopefully soon a new government. It will be actually the 10th government in 10 years, a little bit like what happens in Italy, but actually in a more accelerated rate. Of course, there are several internal dynamics that led to this issue, to this situation in Tunisia. Even though actually the government dealt very well with COVID-19, Tunisia today is almost COVID-free. But if you follow the development of the current crisis, of the current political crisis in Tunisia, you can start it. The starting point would be the visit of Recep Tayyip Erdogan in December 2019. By then, he reportedly asked for an authorization to use Tunisian land and airspace for the Libya campaign. The Tunisian president refused, but the leaders of the Islamist-inspired Nahda party, who are considered close to Ankara, attempted to intercede or to mediate with the Tunisian president, and they failed. And actually that triggered a deeper crisis between the president and Nahda, and led to the current situation. So there are several events that happened in the country since then, including tumultuous parliamentary and media debates about the Turkish role in Libya. And so this issue actually deepened the political polarization that is taking place in the country. And it is actually a reminder, now the situation in Tunisia in terms of polarization is somewhat reminiscent of the 2013 crisis. Algeria is also worried about the situation in Libya, both for security reasons and for geopolitical ones. Sudan is also impacted by the conflict in Libya. There are mercenaries from Sudan in Libya, up to 3,000 mercenaries, according to a number of sources. Some of them are actually most of them are actually fighting for the LNA in Libya. And there was an interview of The Guardian interviewed a number of them, I think in January, and they said that some of these fighters say that their ultimate goal is to go back to Sudan and fight against the authorities there. So a little bit like what happened in Mali in 2012. And of course, the Sahel is deeply and directly impacted by the situation in Libya. In January, the Secretary General of the UN said that the situation in Libya will impact the Sahel and Lake Chad countries as far as the Ivory Coast and Ghana. And this is not an exaggeration. Again, we all remember the putsch of 2012 in Mali, which was linked to the transfer of arms and fighters from Libya. And Mali, it should be reminded, doesn't share borders with Libya. Also, most recently, last year, there was a convoy of fighters from Libya that was heading to Chad, that was bombed, according to most reports, by French jets. So this convoy belongs to a rebel organization that is a Chadian rebel organization that is based in Libya. So as you see, the countries in the region are directly impacted by the situation in Libya. And I will now conclude with a few recommendations. And I think The first one would be that the immediate neighbors of Libya, the leaders of the immediate neighbors of Libya, need to sit together. So far, Algeria and Egypt do occasionally host high-level discussions with officials from Tunisia, Chad, Niger, and so on, to advance security cooperation, but their efforts remain limited in ambitions. And the multiple alliances of these countries make cooperation so far difficult, or at least limited. The second recommendation may be, as I said, there is this geopolitical rivalry between NATO member states, France, Greece, and Turkey. And it's surprising that so far there was no specific NATO meeting to tackle this issue, while I think it's a priority. And the third one, I think if the EU, the European Union, wants to be taken seriously in Libya, it has to confront all sides and show more impartiality. Operation Irini, for instance, is mainly an anti-Turkish operation that fits Emirati, Egyptian, French foreign policy interests, but so that it targets one side and it doesn't target another side, while all these sides are playing directly in Libya. And in 30 seconds, I say thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Yosef, and I'm sure we'll be back later to test some of those recommendations and see whether we can actually progress them. And it's also a reminder to those of you watching this virtually that you're encouraged also to post your questions for that session coming up. But now we'll move on to our second virtual speaker, Younes Abayoub, who's joining us. Welcome, Ahlan, from New York, who is the director of the Governance and State Building Division for the MENA region at the United Nations, New York. So please, Younes, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the floor to discuss such a complex issue. I'll try to do my best in between 7 and 10 minutes. The conflicts in the Middle East and North Africa have been multiplying, as we all know, and increasingly intersecting, which complicates actually and delays more and more the effort to resolve them. So the big question, can the region recover from what's been going on for at least a decade now? And if so, what shape will this region look like in the future? National identities, which were subsumed by a series of competing subnational identities, are more and more shaken in these uncertain times. We see, for instance, there are some forms of local governance that are appearing where the state has dissolved and little by little receding. And we can see this in Yemen, we see it in Libya, we see it in Syria, Iraq. And some of them constitute experiments that might prevent a return of the fierce authoritarian states in the region, or maybe even the state to court. Some obstacles to attempts by societies also to reconstruct the social fabric that have been severely damaged during these years is also appearing. These current conflicts have become more and more intersecting now. They started at the national level, but now it's no longer a national issue. There's another element that is trans-regional, and which is more and more the increasing regional and international geopolitical competition that is taking the form of direct external interventions, while at the beginning they were not so direct and so obvious. That will do even greater harm by militarizing solutions to what is intrinsically a political problem, and of course that emanates originally from socioeconomic challenges and development failures in all these countries of the region. This will further polarize already divided polities and undermine either local efforts or national efforts to reestablish or renegotiate social contracts to rebuild these polities. So we should all actually gain a more nuanced understanding of the current crisis that is exacerbated even further now with the pandemic. And we should look into more policy design that at least do no harm, if not contribute to a more stable future for the region. Since 2011, at least, the Arab world has been undergoing a series of development systemic shocks. 2011 has been a major one. But the region is also facing a lot of different challenges. The turmoil which took place in 2011, which became, as I said earlier, as a domestic or national issue, has since developed to far more complex regional ramifications and more and more global. Since then, the domestic focus of concern has moved from the issues of socioeconomic and development challenges to a more of a security issue, which is rapidly imploding across the region. The domestic politics have therefore moved from what is supposed to be a reform at the governance level, socioeconomic level, to a more security agenda, which is dangerously ignoring the fact that socioeconomic issues were the driving factors of all this at the beginning. So we're, in a way, the region finds itself in the conundrum of the chicken and egg dilemma. So while security forces are overstretched everywhere, defense budgets are rising across the region, and the security vacuums which have opened up in the wake of the events of 2011 in most of these countries have expanded, and illicit networks at the regional level have grown into full-scale non-state and terrorist organizations. Sometimes these organizations cooperate between themselves, sometimes not, sometimes they compete, but they are expanding more and more, as the former speakers said, for instance, in the Libyan conflict toward the Sahel and the sub-Saharan Africa. There have been an alarming rise of terrorism across the region, often combated by armed forces rather by internal security services or preemptive actions. This will reinforce, which is a trend we already see now, the political role of the military. While we see new terrorism laws conflates political opposition with terrorist activities. So security sector reform, which should have been the focus from the beginning, is now even further postponed virtually everywhere. So this is another trans-regional challenge, which basically put the region in a vicious circle that threatens the region with more protracted and complex conflicts. The socioeconomic level. The region remains challenged in economic terms. Arab GDP that was already a decade ago very low compared to the world average. A lot of disparities and inequalities across the region have increased. So we clearly face serious difficulties in terms of wealth creation and distributions, which are the origin of these issues. With the proliferation now of conflict in the region, parallel economic systems have established themselves, and they will fuel even more ongoing cycle of violence. Yemen and Syria have evolved clearly from a state that were beset by economic problems and social issues to full-blown war economies. In terms of the Human Development Index, for instance, today Syria is back where it was almost 4 decades ago. And even at a very optimistic growth rate, it will take at least 30 or 40 years for Syria to return, if ever, to its GDP values before a decade ago. The issue, of course, of the pandemic just exacerbates the problems that already existed. But Syria is only an example among several other economies, Libya, Yemen, Iraq, and over the region, even those countries that have not imploded so far. The struggling economies of the region are the outcome of several different developments. It's not only the conflict. The conflict have exacerbated what already existed. I mean, issues of weak institutions, corruption, delayed reforms, low foreign direct investment, lack of resources for some countries, especially the LDCs. All these have called for urgent reforms to address the deteriorating security and business environment. But unfortunately, this has not been addressed timely, and the COVID-19 pandemic plus the ramifications of the conflicts are just making things even more complex for the years to come. I heard reference this morning to the Sykes-Picot agreement in Sèvres. It's a big question about Sykes-Picot states. I mean, all Arab states today struggle with national identity. This has been highlighted by the ongoing debate on the disappearance of the Sykes-Picot states, as the main political ideologies are now more and more regional than national, and implicitly seek the abolition of the Arab state as such. Mr. Capel talked about the Ottomanization of foreign policy of Turkey, for instance. We have Iran looking at its own revenge in the region. The different forms of Islamism reject the regional state system as it is, and as we have known it for almost a century now, and they seek to establish a large, different type of organization and polities. Again, one of the challenges that these conflicts have created at the regional level is the proliferation of small arms and light weapons. Although the Arab region has been militarized to significant extent since the end of the World War II, the last decades particularly has seen an increase in arms proliferation. So broadly speaking, there are three dimensions to this: the diversion and stockpile leakages in the post-conflict settings. I mean, Libya and Iraq, for instance, even Yemen, the transfer of arms to non-state actors, and the ongoing military buildups by states that are afraid of the spillover of these conflicts on their national security. Conflicts, of course, are the main culprits in this regard. They create conditions for either government releasing weapons into the population or looting of stockpiles, for instance. This is a clear case of Libya. The invasion of Iraq led to the transfer of at least 4 million, if not more, of small arms and light weapons to non-state actors or the wider civilian population, some of which ended up being used in the insurgency and the rise of the terrorist group Islamic State. In Libya, more than 15 million weapons have ended up not only in the hands of the population, but spread into as many as 14 countries in the region, or rather the sub-region. The proliferation of weapons, of course, is always a worrisome trend, especially in the region that is very unstable. In this case, they do facilitate the onset of violence and instability. There are ways, of course, of mitigating this, but unfortunately, at the early stage of these revolution or rebellions or transitions, we call them different names because there's no real agreement on what happened. For instance, Libya, there was no real national dialogue at the beginning, or no security sector reform or DDR at the beginning. So what happened in Libya is a complete shift of priorities that were wrong. Instead of going for the establishment of the foundation of the new state, things went directly towards power sharing modalities that actually undermine any process of state construction on one of the main bases should have been DDR. The second also security trend.
Your time is pretty much up, but I hope this is your concluding.
Okay.
Thank
So
you.
I wanted to talk about the rise of extremism and organized crime, which are more and more linked in the region. But we can leave this to the question and answer. But in sum, what I want to say is that the picture is far from rosy. Of course, Arab states are, looking at many years of more complication. But at the same time, these challenges also, in my opinion, present the region with opportunities. There is need for serious rethinking of policies that have led the region to what it is today.
Well, thank you. We'll come back to
just
you.
one point that is important. Okay. In dealing with the conflict resolution of these conflicts, one thing that the international community keeps missing is that we look at them in the silo mentality. We look at Libya alone, we look at Syria alone, we look at Iraq. Well, these have become way more transregional. So any attempt at resolving them should, from now on, look at them from a regional and more increasingly global perspective. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll come back to you. Okay. Right, finally, last but certainly not least, Mitchell Belfer, President of the Euro-Gulf Information Centre, will be our last contributor.
Thank you. First, thank you for having me today. I woke up this morning to being in the middle of the Cold War that's happening in the Middle East. And so I'm a little bit shaken by all that. But nonetheless, I like to start my presentations always with a joke, because you'll see how the relevance is. So a man walks into a doctor's office and he says, doctor, you have to help me. My brother, he thinks he's a chicken. And the doctor looks at him and says, well, that's ridiculous. Just go tell him he's not a chicken. I can't do it, doctor, because I need the eggs. And unfortunately, across the Middle East, since the end, and this is where I really begin our chapter, since the end of World War I, you have a lot of state building that's been going on. And a lot of the different groups and the different countries that are engaged in state building are simultaneously looking inwards, but they're also looking outwards at what they believe are their eggs. And so from what I would like, I'm a bit of an optimist, I have to say it. I'm a Middle Eastern optimist in the sense that I believe that today will be better than tomorrow. However, you see, it's that little trick, that little play on words. However, it's I think very important to keep a bit of optimism. And I say that from the perspective of being here in Europe and of course being hosted by the NATO Defense College Foundation, NATO Defense College as well, and the Center for the South and the South Studies. I think that it's very important for us to remember a little bit of where we came from and what the conditions were in Europe 100 years ago as we went through these tremendous conflicts. By the way, after World War I, we should be remembered that people were walking around with masks just the same. We had a terrible pandemic that paralyzed our European and international economies. And they say the rest is history, but history lives in motion. And I think it's important that I know that one of the speakers earlier today reminded us of the return to a mosque of Hagia Sophia and the way that the Imam walked up the pulpit carrying a sword from 100 years ago, from the Ottoman Empire. It's easy for us to now look backwards and say we can reconcile ourselves with history, but not everybody can. And I think that what we're experiencing now is not renewed conflict. It's a continuous conflict. The only differences, the major differences, and the area that I would like to focus the majority of my talk on is the way that power has been distributed, the way that alliances have been formed, and also the way that anarchy is interacting with these two. So in other words, we actually have to go back to international relations theory, traditional international relations theory, the same theories that were developed when we were going through the Cold War in Europe and globally, of course. And we have to try to make sense using the same parameters that we had walked through all those decades ago. We have to try to make sense of what is occurring now in the Middle East. So very quickly, when we talk about power, there's such a gross power imbalance that we experience in the Middle East. There had been a time, we can call it, Pax Americana, or the American moment, which essentially, was between the end of the Soviet Union and carried us right through until September 11th. But after September 11th, America's gut reaction has been both hot and cold when it came to the region. So, of course, jumping into Iraq with all the consequences that we know that happened there, but also talking at times of pivoting out of the Middle East. So it sends all these mixed messages, but what it's producing is a kind of vacuum on top. And that vacuum on top is not being exploited necessarily by the international actors, but rather they're being exploited by the local actors as these actors come to terms with where their power ends and their neighbor's power begins. And so I think it is very important for us to see also and try to anticipate what kind of region we're heading to. Are we heading into a region of parity and balance of power? Are we heading into a region of hegemony or preponderance of power? Because in either case, the international community is going to have to adjust itself to how the outcome of this long-term struggle looks like. The second part that, of course, when you have this power struggle on the highest level, the second part to think about is anarchy. And what we're facing in the world today, and what we're facing in the region today, because you don't have an agreement on the balance of power, you're having increased anarchy. And that anarchy, again, is going to reinforce the vacuums. And most importantly, it's been eroding the institutions that had been slowly but steadily building in the region to create mechanisms of dialogue and communication between the various actors. Now we can say, I think, quite clearly, an institution like the League of Nations, like the League of Arab States, like the League of Nations as well, of course, but like the League of Arab States, has become more of a talk shop instead of fulfilling what its original mandate had been, which was to essentially consolidate policy behaviors amongst the Arab countries. We have not seen major institutionalization since. The only true exception to this is the Gulf Cooperation Council. And in the GCC, of course, we know that there's the intra-GCC crisis that continues, to hamper deepening of that institution. But at its very core and its very reasoning, the GCC is an important organization which not only provides communications, but it also provides security, and it had intended to provide a common economic space so that all the countries could benefit. That's as close as we've come to filling and to preventing the complete anarchy from gripping the region. So there's scope for institutionalization there as well. And finally, in relation to alliances, we've seen tremendous shifts over the past decade or so in the way that alliances have been configured in the region. For example, 10, 12 years ago, we would have, maybe a little longer ago, 10 years ago, we would have been rather referring to the Israel, Turkey, Egypt, Jordan, maybe not alliance, but at least grouping. Israel and Turkey had been cooperating and collaborating on almost every security-related issue. Now we're talking about an Israel, Greece, Cyprus, and then you have, of course, Egypt continues to play a role with Israel, but now you're also referring to an Egypt, Saudi Arabia, a Jordan Gulf Cooperation Council, even a Morocco Gulf Cooperation Council alignment, which has been steadily and consistently brewing. So, I'm totally over time. I'm sorry, the minutes have just vanished.
No, you still have 2 minutes.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's when it's red, it means you're in danger zone.
I'm in the danger zone. Sorry, I saw the green to red and I just panicked.
No, it'll start flashing.
So again, what we see is these major shifts in alliances. We see anarchy, and we see that there's these power voids on the top and these vacuums. So it's very easy. Of course, we have to look at all three of the main levels. We have to look at the individuals. We have to look at, now there's difference of communication because technologies have changed. But the core issues that are unfolding in the Middle East today are the very same that were left over from the First World War. So if we want to keep dealing with the symptoms of problems, fair enough. But actually, if we want to deal and create proper solutions, we have to go to the root causes of what these problems are. The way that decolonization took place, which groups were empowered and which groups were not empowered, which territories have been, for example, artificially divided, and how do we reconcile that? So mechanisms need to be put in place, not to deal with the last 3 years, but to deal with the last century of turmoil in the region. It's made especially clear now because of the removal of the Cold War system and the temporary United States total hegemony in the region that's been reduced in part by its own internal situation, but also in part because of a changing world. So I often remark that we don't have a crystal ball. We do have a crystal ball. The future of the Middle East is the future of Europe, or the present of Europe. The same processes that led to a united Europe are also at play in the Middle East today. we're not just talking about a blanket rejection, for example, of a European Union. Of course, I'm optimistic, but I'm not, in my head in the clouds. I don't think that tomorrow we're going to wake up and we're going to be in a European Union as such of the Middle East. But I do think that the same mechanisms that were at play, the great power struggles, the dynamics on the social level, the changing economies, youth empowerment, all these things are going to create a bit more levity in the future generations of international politics of the Middle East. And I leave you on that note that, in fact, we do have a crystal ball. And if we steer the course, we could end up on the other side with something that is prosperous and that is contributing to global affairs and not just to the nation states that compose the Middle East.
Right, thank you. Right. Now we have the difficult task of encapsulating all the questions. I've already seen one from the floor, including the virtual ones, in about a quarter of an hour. So I've been asked to start the ball rolling. I think I'll make my question or reflections generic, which is, I think all of you have spoken of fragmentation and inherently, explicitly or less explicitly, the lack of leadership. And I know, following on from what you said, Mitchell, there's an increasing debate out there about the future of the state as constructed on existing models and the return of empires. And when we talk of the return of the empires, we're thinking of the Turkish Empire. So we've already had previously mention of the Ottoman Empire. The Russians are in the business of building an empire. What does that mean for the Middle East? And I suppose the main question I would ask is where you're looking at things from, where you're working from, and this is a question for all of you, whether at the UN, whether in NATO HQ, what significant form of leadership would make a difference? Where do you wish to see leadership coming from? Because it could be, as I think, Eunice, you've hinted at, bottom up. We need to pay more attention to socio-economic changes. If you look at historical theories, indeed practice of disruptive change, it's very rarely does the new normal come, sorry to use that phrase, the new dispensation comes from on top. It's actually this fragmentation of existing institutions that leads the way and offers the opportunity for something completely different to come, like a black swan from somewhere completely different. So this could be, for example, an area I'm interested in, the younger generations of the region, which Karim spoke so strongly about earlier, actually doing something very disruptive because they are the digital natives. They can do things virtually that the older generations can't do. But that presupposes a semblance of an infrastructure for them to do that, security, stability enough for a new type of economics to emerge. So that's just one example. So my question to all of you very briefly, if you can give me a very short response, what type of new leadership do you think would make a difference to where you're sitting? And I'll start with Dr. Romani. Can you hear me? Giovanni, the question is to you. And you had a specific challenge to say how you're going to resolve intra-NATO problems, but you might leave that to one side. But what kind of leadership do you think we need to see?
If you're talking about the leadership we need to see in the Middle East, I would say a leadership that aggregates, that looks at multilateralism, that looks into areas that unite, that leverages membership in international organizations, and so on. So that goes towards regional stability. That's the leadership I would like to see. Let me offer another consideration, which is my personal opinion. This is not going to be a NATO position, of course. When since I engage, of course, on a daily basis with these ambassadors, particularly these countries, you talk about leadership. For example, the countries of the Gulf, they come from a certain level of stability, if you think about it, because they have ruling families that have ensured like a certain continuity. And actually, those countries that have been lucky have also had visionary leaders that were able to project the country into the long term. And so this kind of long-term perspective looks for a partnership, which is also long-term. And that is where I would argue that countries such as Russia and China have a certain advantage, because those interlocutors are actually interlocutors which are stable, and it's not always the same when the Middle Eastern, let's say, more stable countries as far as government engage with the Western world, in which we have governments that can change like from one year to the other, and not always maintain a certain continuity of policy. So that is where I would say we have to look at leadership in the Middle East, or we have to look at leadership also in the West.
Okay, Dr. Rani, while I'm here, we have a question, a virtual one from Zoom, which is, do you have any perspective for inclusive NATO, ICI, and NATO Mediterranean dialogue in mind? Where is the overlap between these two? And are there plans to make one?
There are no current plans to make one. They are different geographically and also in terms of content. Med Dialogue is a much longer partnership program, which went more like into the depth of cooperation with a number of countries. And the ICI is younger, and I would say still in development. The advantage we have in ICI is that now we were able to establish a center in Kuwait, which I hope will bring forward this cooperation program, but I would say it still hasn't catched up with the Med Dialogue yet. And I do not see how they can merge, and they're very different, and so I don't see any perspective of merging them. But certainly I see a lot of promising kind of avenues for the evolution of both of them.
Thank you. Back to Yusuf for the original leadership question.
So I think what is needed are leaders that represent their own population, that are accountable for their own population. Otherwise, we'll keep having these dictators who are, one, very brutal, two, who would see national security or their people's security from a very narrow point of view, that actually respond to the people who are around them, who are their cour, and who would be more accountable to their foreign masters, be it the Europeans, the Turks, the Americans, rather than their own population. But you would tell me, well, representative leaders, we've had that in 2011 in some Arab countries, and it didn't work that well. It's true. And here comes the point of empowering youth. And I think that's, I mean, from a utopian or a realist perspective, both of them, that's the most important thing. We need to empower youth in the region. And a few countries are doing that, but frankly, most Arab countries today are most Arab countries today are empowering co-opted youth. So actually, they are empowering the youth that belong to their circles, or who are completely vassalized, if I can use the term, to their own, and so they don't see the other alternative, they don't see the other point of view, and therefore we're not really empowering youth in the Arab world, while that's the most important thing that should happen.
Well, can I assure you, I have it on good authority that the non-co-opted youth of the region are busy empowering themselves, and they're doing it below the radar, because the whole point is they don't want to be co-opted. Whether they succeed or not, we won't know until they succeed. So it's one of those conundrums that historical change usually takes place out of sight, gathers momentum, gathers speed, and then emerges to the surprise of those who didn't see it coming, but that's intentional. So let's hope that works. Eunice, it's your turn. What kind of leadership would you like?
Well, it's interesting that I use the we as a global we, have not learned lessons from the past. And in 2011, when you had these movements that were initiated in Tunisia and other places, where you could have empowered local voices so that people of the region could determine their future and build their policies the way they see fit, they were not given that chance, unfortunately, because of the way the world functioned. It's interesting to see, for instance, that Tunisia, where there was no intervention at the beginning, they succeeded to a certain extent and avoided violence. It is also interesting to see Yemen until 2015 with the first and only national dialogue conference that managed to avoid the violence in Yemen. I mean, Yemen is an interesting example because it's one of the countries in that region which has a huge amount of weapons, small arms, and individual weapons. They were not used in 2011 until the agreement and the national dialogue outcomes were basically stifled by the military intervention in 2015. These are two interesting cases about leadership, and the fact that the new leaderships were not allowed to emerge have made these frustrations even more serious and go into more conflict. Regarding leadership that exists today, and connecting it with your question about the return of the empire and the recent receding national states, it is also interesting to note that there's only two major projects of empire in the region so far, which is the Iranian one and the Turkish one. There's no Arab project, unfortunately. And so far, all the Arab movements have been just reactions to what's been happening. And it's increasingly the case that the future looks more a divide not on national identities, but mostly because of the new discourse between leaders of the Sunnis and leaders of the Shia, which is clear in the competition between in the region between Turkey and Iran.
Thank you. So is the implication that the Arabs will become victims of somebody else's successful empire? I'm perhaps reading too much into your comments.
No, it's true. It's true. It's already the case. It's not the future. It's already happening.
They already have been.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Mitchell, you were the one who raised anarchy and hegemony. So what kind of leadership would you like to see, and perhaps how do we get it?
Well, first, I'd like to, perhaps it's important to look at it as a process.
Yeah.
Leadership has always been a process, no matter where you are in the world. So there's no silver bullet to what kind of leadership in which particular country. What I think would be more apt is we can refer to it perhaps as maturing sovereignty. Mm-hmm. Sovereignty is a very tricky situation, a very tricky concept. And if Europe and the European experience has taught us anything, is that countries that are secure in their sovereignty then try to get rid of their sovereignty and pool together sovereignty, as we've seen both in NATO in the security field, but also in the European Union on all levels. And then, of course, you have the requisite reactionary behavior, for example, like Britain's withdrawal and Brexit. But nonetheless, I think that there are lessons to be learned about how to respect each other's sovereignty, no matter what leadership or ideology the countries have. Because personally, if Iraq is a blossoming democracy or if it's a Marxist dictatorship, that's the answer to its people, or its people will answer that issue. It should not be a regional issue because of the kind of regime that Iraq has. But because countries are running after their so-called eggs, they allow their ideology to play a role in how they see their neighbors. So I think what we have to do is come up with a red line on sovereignty, so that when the countries can feel secure enough in their borders, then they can start talking about getting rid of this kind of competition, getting rid of the sovereign walls that separate them.
I think you would have friends in Beijing for saying that. I think it's a very Chinese reflection. Right, I'm opening now to the floor. I've seen one hand. Oh, one hand already. It's time to get the glasses on. So shall I start at this side? It's not very democratic. I'll start at this side of the room and move across. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm Rear Admiral Fabio Agostini. I'm Operation Commander, Operation Irini. It's not my habit to argue with such a qualified panel, but I think I cannot leave this audience with a wrong message that I heard just from Mr. Sharif. I would like to underline that the statement that Iran is against Turkey is completely wrong. And let's say that we can start in mentioning the council decision that launched the operation, the statement of Mr. Borrell, of course, even the results that we have achieved so far, that are both in the side of the two parts. We are not against anybody. We are not against Turkey. We are not against Russia. We are against the traffic, the illicit traffic in Libya, whatever they are, weapons, oil smugglers, and human trafficking. So I would like to underline that your statement is wrong, but if you like, we can argue a little bit more during the coffee break. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that clarification. Right, who's next? A familiar face, I think you'll find, when he takes his mask off.
Most kind. I wanted to ask a question to Mitchell, probably, who is freer to answer. Minimum common denominator. Well, at least, for NATO countries, it should be Russia. What do you think about? Thank you.
Have you got a quick response to that, and then I'll ask the next person to go up?
Yeah, I mean, oh, sorry.
No, you answer while the other person, it's logistics.
Yes, so absolutely. I mean, especially for NATO's foundation, the Soviet Union had been the common denominator to bring them together. In the Middle East, I think it's too diverse. Some countries, especially those that are proximate to Israel, have felt that Israel is going to be the greater threat. Those that are further away, especially after the revolution in Iran, 1979, they've felt more of the acuteness of Iranian presence. And now you have also Turkey for some time. So I think that you don't have this common denominator. Although there could be, I mean, we like to paint things in broad strokes, but I don't see that. So I think we have to create one. And in creating one, it doesn't have to be the demonization of somebody else. But I think that there are, for example, the future. And you can rally around the kind of future that you want for your region and for your people. But, I think you're right. In the security, on a security level. But anything short of that, I think that at this point, at least even in security affairs, you do not have that kind of agreement.
Okay, next question.
Yes, my question is, what should be the relationship between NATO and EU, in particular today, as the Admiral says, there are misunderstandings on these important operations of Irini, and obviously there is no exit strategy like in the European Union in NATO. So Turkey is an ally, and how, according to you both, because Mr. Mitchell said about the integration, also processes that are happening in Mediterranean and MENA region. I'm not talking about Arab world, as Karim said correctly this morning. So what should be the relationship between these two international organizations that are fundamental for the stabilization of the area? Thank you.
Is that addressed to the whole panel or to two people in particular?
Mr. Mitchell and also, I forgot.
Yusuf.
Yes, Yusuf, thanks.
Okay, right. Very quick responses, and I'll just check one last question, otherwise we're going to have to draw the line. Right, there's a gentleman at the back, so if you'd like to go to the mic, ready. Quick response, please.
Yeah, I mean, just sorry for being provocative regarding the Irini question, but my point was that weapons coming to Libya come by land, sea, and air. So by land, they come easily from Egypt and from the south. By air, they come from Turkey, but also from the UAE. But by sea, it's mainly Turkey. So yes, it's not meant to be an anti-Turkish operation, but it happens to be like that. And with regard to the second question, I mean, from between EU and NATO, I think there is a lot of common agreements, common principles. So it's from someone from outside, it's always surprising to see so much disagreements happening among these different countries.
Yeah, I would very quickly add that I think the best thing that NATO and the EU can do to Gulf and to Middle Eastern in general institutions is lessons learned. We have to know that it wasn't an easy process. We have to know that France left NATO's military planning for what, 3 decades, 4 decades? That Greece and Turkey, NATO members, sometimes fight each other. That the road to building an institution that functions is not easy, but it's a road worth taking. And if you, of course, now when you look at the state of Europe and the distrust that we all have now towards European institutions, of course, we say, oh, but was it worth it in the end? But yes, it was worth it all in the end. And so I think that's the only real thing to do, is to impart those lessons learned, to reassure our allies and friends in the Middle East that this is a process, and that because we live in this very interactive worlds, that we have these expectations that come very, very quickly. We have to provide a realistic assessment of how those goals can be achieved without it being so transactional over a longer time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, I've noticed we've got 2 further questions, so if you could keep them very brief. We are now eating into coffee time.
Thank you. I have two very brief questions. One is related to the role of Turkey. We have reports about increasing involvement of Turkey in Yemen. We've been told of what is happening in Eastern Mediterranean. So the question is how all these can affect the role of NATO in the region through the exercises that NATO has with the region. The second question is about China, which has not been mentioned in the panel up to now. So how do you see the role of China at the moment in the region? Thank you.
Well, I think the role of China is another whole lecture, but I assume that's addressed to the whole panel?
Yes.
Okay, I'll ask you to hold that. Please stand forward for your question.
Good afternoon. My name is China Molares from Luis Guido Carli. My question is addressed to Mr. Belfer. I really appreciate your optimism about what you said, but one thing that you should consider is once we get over the Islamic radicalization in the whole zone, there is something else, that what you mentioned as sovereignty is a certain sense of nationalism that is growing in all these countries, not only in the Middle East, but also in the MENA region. And as an example, you can see there are many people who are not Islamists, but are actually supporting the Erdogan decision regarding the Santa Sofia or Hagia Sophia. You can see that considering this, do you think the cooperation and the union that you have in mind for future can be achievable? Thank you.
Okay, I'll remind everyone we're talking about civil societies later on this afternoon, so we can actually tackle some of that. But Mitchell, you can respond. The first questions, though, Giovanni, do you have any response to that, or are you still with us? No, I think he's gone. So no time at all for any responses. Yusuf, you've got 2 seconds, but
2 seconds on Turkey. I think Turkey's tried a few times to bring NATO in, and we've seen it recently in Libya when Russia started putting planes and adding more weapons in Libya. Turkey was playing on the NATO card, but most of the time NATO is being a rogue NATO. Turkey is being a rogue NATO country, and it's also surprising that there are no measures at all taken to calm Turkey down.
Right, thank you very much. Would you say the same?
Yeah, so I'll be very quick just to answer. I would think that so-called Islamic radicalism and nationalism are actually 2 sides of the same coin. And what it is, it's that process of state building. And so again, just to reiterate it, I do not think that we're going to wake up in a European Union styled Middle East anytime soon. But in order to get there eventually, we do have to reconcile ourselves with what are national interests and national identities as they continue to form and change as a result of the changes that are unfolding in the wider world. Nationalism, as you rightly said, is not just a phenomenon in the Middle East. It's a phenomenon that's spiking everywhere in the world. But we would not look in Italy and ask ourselves, do we still belong in Italy? Do we still belong in the European Union? Just because some form of nationalism is spiking, or maybe in the UK they did that. But I think the point is that we have to be aware of how to adjust those kinds of ideologies with the states that are emerging and maturing.
Okay, thank you. Eunice, since you're still with us and no one has said anything about China, that's the
Well, China, I see its role at least twofold. One, there is indirect in these conflicts, being the rising power that could probably reestablish a new sort of a new order in multilateralism, which has been extremely weakened during the last at least decade, and more by the nationalist tendencies of many countries, and especially the US. The more direct role that I see probably in the Middle East, the first example that comes to mind is Lebanon, that we see now more and more talk within the Lebanese circles that they want to move towards the east and maybe have China get involved in rebuilding infrastructure, in investment. If that happens in Lebanon, that means it's going to happen in the whole Levant region, reaching Iraq, Syria, Yemen, in the Gulf and other regions. Then it will become a major player. So China is definitely there, not directly yet, but it is going to play a role.
Thank you very much. I also heard the same in Iran, but that's another discussion. Right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We're now going to take half an hour coffee break. So that will be from 14:40 now until 5:10. And to the virtual audience, thank you for staying with us. We will resume in half an hour's time. So the conference will be reactivated when we're back at 5:10. Thank you very much, and thank you to the panel.